A crowded restaurant, clinking glasses, low laughter. Then a towering 250-pound wrestler decides the small, quiet man at the corner table is an easy joke. He's wrong. What follows isn't just speed or strength, it's discipline meeting ego, philosophy confronting noise, and a lesson about power that no one in the room forgets. In 5 seconds, humiliation flips into awakening. But the real story isn't the confrontation, it's what happens after. How restraint, respect, and self-mastery turn conflict into transformation. This is a human story about size versus presence, force versus control, and why true strength never needs to shout. A moment of mockery becomes a masterclass in psychology, martial arts philosophy, and the science of calm under pressure. Some people fight to win. Some win by refusing to fight at all. The restaurant was alive with the ordinary music of evening life, cutlery tapping porcelain, glasses chiming in uneven rhythm, low laughter rising and falling like waves against a shore. Steam curled upward from bowls of soup. Soy sauce, garlic, and sizzling oil drifted through the air in comforting layers. It was the kind of place where people came not to be noticed, but to belong to the noise. At a corner table near the window sat a man who seemed, at first glance, almost invisible. He wore a simple dark shirt. His posture was upright but relaxed, like a tree that had grown exactly where it was meant to stand. His hands rested lightly beside his plate, fingers long and still. His eyes moved without hurry, noticing everything: the rhythm of the kitchen doors swinging open, the tension in a server's shoulders, the impatience in a customer tapping chopsticks against a bowl. He ate with quiet precision, not slowly, not quickly, just deliberately. Most people in the room didn't know who he was. A few thought they recognized him but weren't sure enough to stare. To them, he was simply a small, composed man dining alone. But presence is not measured in inches or pounds, and the atmosphere around him held a kind of gravity that wasn't visible, only felt. Bruce Lee had always believed that a person reveals themselves most honestly in ordinary moments. Not in the dojo, not on a stage, but in stillness, in habit, in how they occupy space when no one is watching. He lifted a cup of tea and inhaled gently before sipping. Be like water, he reminded himself, not as a slogan, but as a living principle. Water did not resist shape. It adapted. It flowed. It yielded without surrendering its nature. Outside, neon light shimmered against the glass window, bending across reflections of people who moved without awareness of the small, quiet center forming in the room. Then the door opened with a force that didn't match the setting. The first thing that entered wasn't the man, it was his presence. Heavy, loud, assertive. The air shifted as if something dense had been dropped into it. He was enormous. Broad shoulders stretched the seams of his shirt, arms like carved stone. His footsteps were not particularly loud, yet people noticed them. Conversations dipped. A few heads turned instinctively. There is a certain size that announces itself without asking permission. He laughed as he entered, not at anything in particular, but as a declaration of arrival. 2 companions followed, both large, both carrying themselves with the easy swagger of men accustomed to occupying space without question. The hostess greeted them with practiced warmth, but even her smile tightened slightly. She led them to a table near the center of the room. The large man sat with a heavy drop into his chair, as if claiming territory. He was a professional wrestler known locally, admired by some, feared by others, and deeply accustomed to being the largest figure in any room. He scanned the restaurant lazily, eyes drifting across faces, measuring, comparing, assessing. Then he saw Bruce Lee. At first, his gaze passed over him. Then it returned. Something about the contrast amused him: the small frame, the calm posture, the almost delicate stillness. He smirked. To a man who defined strength by mass, the sight triggered a reflex older than thought: comparison. His companions followed his gaze. One leaned closer and muttered something. They chuckled. Bruce Lee continued eating. He did not look up. He did not acknowledge them, not out of avoidance, but because attention, like energy, should be spent intentionally. Across the room, a server placed a dish on the wrestler's table. He thanked her loudly, performatively, as if even gratitude required an audience. "Man," he said, voice carrying farther than necessary, "you ever notice how some people think being small makes them fast?" His companion snorted. He picked up his fork but did not eat. Instead, he leaned back, chair creaking under his weight. "You can't fight physics," he continued. "Mass wins." He flexed one arm casually, not to admire it but to be admired. Bruce Lee lifted another bite of food, chewed, swallowed, drank tea. The wrestler watched him more directly now. "Hey!" he called across the room. "You train or something?" The question was not truly a question. It was bait disguised as curiosity. Bruce Lee placed his chopsticks down gently and looked up. His gaze was calm, neutral, almost warm the way one might regard a passing cloud. "I practice," he said simply. His voice did not compete with the room. It did not need to. Those closest heard it clearly, and the tone carried farther than volume would have. The wrestler leaned forward. "Practice what? Breathing?" Laughter from his companions. Bruce Lee did not respond immediately. He lifted his tea again, observed the steam, observed the space between himself and the other man. Conflict, he had learned, begins long before motion. It begins in perception, in identity, in the need to prove something to someone who never asked. He set the cup down. "Practice understanding," he replied. The answer landed strangely. It did not escalate. It did not submit. It existed outside the expected script. The wrestler frowned slightly, not offended, confused. He was accustomed to reactions that fit familiar patterns: intimidation, defensiveness, aggression, or admiration. Calm curiosity did not belong in that list. "So you're a philosopher?" he said, voice sharpening with mock interest. Bruce Lee smiled faintly. "Sometimes." The wrestler leaned back again, louder now. "You know what I think?" He said to no one in particular. "People like that talk big because they can't fight big." The remark drifted across the room, not shouted, but shaped to travel. A ripple of discomfort passed among nearby diners. Social tension has a physical sensation, a tightening, a subtle readiness for disruption. Bruce Lee resumed eating. He did not react because reaction feeds the dynamic the aggressor seeks. Attention is oxygen. Remove it, and many fires suffocate. Yet the wrestler was not accustomed to suffocation. He stood. The motion was not sudden, but its intention was unmistakable. His chair scraped back with a harsh sound that sliced through the room's gentle rhythm. He walked toward Bruce Lee's table. Each step was deliberate, theatrical, a performance disguised as spontaneity. He stopped beside the table and looked down. Up close, the difference in size was stark. The wrestler's shadow fell across the plate, across the tea, across the man who continued sitting calmly within it. "You don't look like much," he said. The statement hovered part observation, part challenge, part invitation. Bruce Lee lifted his gaze again. "Looks are often incomplete information," he replied. The wrestler crossed his arms, amused. "You know," he said, "I weigh 250 pounds. You know what that means?" Bruce Lee considered for a brief moment. "You carry a lot," he said. A few people nearby suppressed smiles. Not mockery, recognition. The wrestler chuckled, but there was a flicker behind it now, a subtle shift from playful dominance toward irritation. He placed one large hand on the table and leaned closer. "What would you do," he asked, "if someone your size had to deal with someone my size?" The question was framed hypothetically, but the room understood its immediacy. Bruce Lee's expression did not change. He spoke quietly. "I would not deal with your size," he said. "I would deal with your intention." The wrestler blinked. He had expected bravado, or fear, or a defensive joke, not conceptual redirection. He straightened slightly. "So what you think technique beats strength?" Bruce Lee folded his hands lightly. "Technique is applied understanding," he said. "Strength without understanding is effort without direction." There was no condescension in his tone, only explanation. The wrestler felt something unfamiliar, not threat, but displacement. The conversation was not occurring on his chosen ground. He tapped the table once, harder than necessary. "Let's say I grabbed you," he said. "Right now, what then?" Bruce Lee's eyes moved briefly to the hand on the table, then back to the man. "You would learn," he said gently. The words were not a warning. They were an observation of cause and effect. Silence pooled around the table. The wrestler searched the smaller man's face for signs of challenge, tension in the jaw, narrowing of the eyes, preparation in the shoulders. He found none, only readiness without anticipation. It unsettled him in a way he did not yet understand, because most people signal conflict before it begins. Fear stiffens, aggression hardens, ego swells. But Bruce Lee exhibited none of these. He simply existed fully present, unthreatened, unattached to outcome. And in human psychology, unpredictability is more destabilizing than opposition. The wrestler withdrew his hand from the table. He laughed again, louder than before, but the laughter had changed shape. "You talk nice," he said. "Real nice." He stepped back half a pace. "You know what? I think you're all theory." He turned to his companions. 5 seconds, he said casually. That's all it would take. The phrase hung in the air like a countdown without a clock. Bruce Lee lifted his chopsticks again. "Time," he said softly, "is experienced differently depending on awareness." The wrestler stared at him. He did not fully understand the statement, but he felt its weight. And in that moment, something subtle shifted in the room, not in position, not in sound, but in perception. The diners were no longer witnessing a confrontation between large and small. They were witnessing two different relationships with power. One defined power as dominance over others. The other defined power as mastery of self. Bruce Lee took another bite of food. The wrestler remained standing. Neither moved toward violence. Yet tension tightened like a drawn bowstring, invisible, silent, inevitable. And somewhere between heartbeat and breath, the distance between mockery and revelation began to close. The room did not grow louder, it grew quieter. Not because people chose silence, but because attention compressed the space. The air seemed to thicken between the two men, one standing like a wall, the other seated like a calm center around which the world could turn without disturbance. The wrestler remained where he was, his presence still imposing, but something inside him had begun to shift. He had approached expecting a reaction that would confirm the narrative he carried about himself. That size commanded respect, that intimidation created order, that dominance defined truth. Instead, he encountered something he could not categorize. Stillness without submission, confidence without aggression, and most unsettling of all, a complete absence of urgency. Human beings are exquisitely sensitive to tension. When a threat appears, the body prepares long before the mind decides what to do. Shoulders tighten, breathing shallows, eyes fix, muscles anticipate. Yet Bruce Lee's body revealed none of these signals. He was relaxed, but not loose, alert, but not strained, present, but not reactive. It is difficult to provoke someone who is not attempting to defend an identity. The wrestler shifted his weight slightly. The movement was small, but to those watching closely, it marked the beginning of an internal recalibration. He was no longer simply performing for an audience. He was trying to understand a phenomenon that did not behave according to his expectations. 5 seconds, he repeated, though the phrase now sounded less like a declaration and more like a question he had not intended to ask. Bruce Lee set his chopsticks down and folded his hands. 5 seconds, he echoed gently, as if considering the concept rather than the challenge. He did not stand. He did not prepare to stand. He simply remained where he was, grounded in the ordinary act of being seated at a table. From a purely mechanical perspective, the difference in size between the two men was undeniable. Mass creates force. Momentum amplifies impact. These are not philosophical ideas, they are physical realities. But martial arts, at their highest level, are not contests of mass. They are studies of timing, alignment, intention, and efficiency. Bruce Lee understood something that many fighters spend decades discovering. Strength is limited by its own investment. The more force one commits, the more predictable one becomes. A heavy object in motion is powerful but also bound to its trajectory. A light object can change direction instantly. "Tell me something," the wrestler said, his voice quieter now, though still edged with challenge. "Do you think speed makes up for size?" Bruce Lee tilted his head slightly. "Speed is not separate from size," he replied. "Speed is the ability to arrive without resistance." The wrestler frowned. The answer did not fit the binary he expected. He wanted a claim he could oppose speed versus strength, technique versus power. But Bruce Lee was not offering a contest. He was describing principles. A few diners leaned forward in their seats. The room had become a classroom without consent. The wrestler extended his arm slightly, palm open, hovering above the table, not touching, not striking, but occupying space deliberately. "What if I push you?" he asked. The question was no longer hypothetical. It was exploratory. Bruce Lee looked at the hand, then at the man. "You would push yourself," he said. The wrestler laughed once, but there was no mockery in it now, only curiosity mixed with impatience. "That doesn't make sense." Bruce Lee's eyes held no trace of challenge. "When two forces meet," he said, "one does not need to oppose the other to change its direction. He lifted a single finger and traced a small arc in the air, a motion so subtle that many would have missed it. Redirection is not resistance, he continued. It is cooperation with momentum. The wrestler stared at the gesture. His world was built on collision, impact, overpowering. The idea of cooperating with force felt counterintuitive, even contradictory. He lowered his hand slowly. You talk like everything is physics, he said. Bruce Lee smiled faintly. Everything is relationship, he replied. There was a pause long enough for breath to become noticeable. The wrestler pulled a chair from a nearby table and sat across from Bruce Lee without asking permission. The movement was less confrontational now, more like an attempt to enter the space on equal terms. From this position, the contrast between them became even more striking. One body carried visible mass and density. The other carried visible economy. Okay, the wrestler said. Show me something. Bruce Lee shook his head gently. There is nothing to show, he said. The wrestler leaned forward, frustration surfacing again. You said I would learn. Bruce Lee nodded once. Learning does not require demonstration, he said. It requires attention. The wrestler exhaled heavily through his nose. He was accustomed to proof in the form of action. Words, to him, were secondary commentary after the fact. Yet something about the man before him made dismissal feel incomplete. He placed both hands flat on the table, palms down. What if I grab your wrist? He asked. Bruce Lee placed one hand lightly on the table's surface. You would hold what you believe is there, he said. The wrestler's brow furrowed. What does that even mean? Bruce Lee's voice remained calm. Most people grab tension, he said. They do not realize tension is not a structure. It is a reaction. The wrestler hesitated. The room seemed to lean inward. Without warning, he reached forward and closed his hand around Bruce Lee's wrist. It was not violent, but it was firm, a grip shaped by years of training, years of controlling bodies larger than his own. At that moment, time did not slow. Perception sharpened. There is a difference. To observers, the sequence that followed unfolded so quickly that they could not isolate its components. But speed was not the defining feature. Clarity was. Bruce Lee did not pull away. He did not resist the grip directly. His arm did not tense. His shoulder did not rise. Instead, his body aligned. The smallest rotation of his wrist changed the angle of contact. A slight shift in his elbow altered the leverage within the wrestler's hand. His posture adjusted not backward, not forward, but into a position where force traveled through structure rather than muscle. Then came the movement that no one fully saw. Not a strike, not a jerk, not an escape, a change. The wrestler's grip, which had felt solid an instant before, suddenly found nothing to hold. Not because the wrist disappeared, but because the relationship between hand and target no longer existed in the same form. The large man's balance shifted unexpectedly. His own forward intention carried him into an empty pathway he had created without realizing it. He did not fall. He did not stumble dramatically. But he moved unmistakably in a direction he had not chosen. Bruce Lee's hand remained where it had been. The entire sequence lasted less than 5 seconds. Silence flooded the room. The wrestler released the wrist slowly, as if testing whether it had truly been free or whether he had imagined the loss of control. He sat back in the chair. His expression had changed. Not humiliated, not angry, not defensive. Puzzled, deeply puzzled. What did you do? He asked. Bruce Lee picked up his tea. Nothing, he said. The answer was not evasive. It was precise. He had not applied force against force. He had not overpowered the grip. He had not demonstrated superiority. He had removed conflict from the equation. The wrestler flexed his fingers unconsciously, replaying the sensation in memory. He had felt structure dissolve not through strength, but through absence of opposition. It contradicted everything his experience had taught him about confrontation. You didn't even try, he said. Bruce Lee nodded slightly. Trying creates friction, he said. Friction slows response. He took a sip of tea. Efficiency, he added, is the art of doing what is necessary and nothing more. The wrestler looked down at his hands again. For the first time since entering the restaurant, he seemed unaware of the audience around him. What if I had used more force? He asked quietly. Bruce Lee set the cup down. Then you would have learned faster, he said. The statement was not a boast. It was a description of principle. The wrestler leaned back in the chair, exhaling slowly. His breathing had deepened, a sign that his nervous system was transitioning from confrontation toward processing. Something important was happening inside him, though he could not yet articulate it. He had expected to prove something. Instead, he had encountered a gap in his understanding, and gaps, when recognized, create the possibility of growth. "Why didn't you fight back?" he asked after a moment. Bruce Lee regarded him with quiet attention. "You were not fighting me," he said. "You were testing an idea." The wrestler absorbed this. He had approached with mockery, yes. With dominance, yes. But beneath that had been curiosity and need to confirm his worldview. Bruce Lee had responded not to the surface behavior, but to the underlying intention. "I could have hurt you," the wrestler said, not as a threat, but as a statement of fact he was accustomed to believing. Bruce Lee nodded. "Yes," he said, "and I could have hurt you." He paused. "But harm is rarely instruction," he continued. "Understanding is." The distinction settled into the space between them. For years, the wrestler had measured outcomes in victories and losses, control and submission, force and resistance. He had never considered that the most powerful demonstration might be the absence of harm when harm was possible. He leaned forward slightly, voice softer now. "How long did that take?" he asked. Bruce Lee answered without hesitation. 5 seconds, he said. The phrase returned transformed, not a boast, not a prediction, a measurement. The wrestler sat in silence. Around them, the restaurant slowly began to breathe again. Conversations resumed in cautious tones. Cutlery touched plates once more. But the atmosphere had changed. Those who had witnessed the exchange did not feel entertained. They felt instructed, because what they had seen was not a contest of bodies, but a revelation of principles that applied far beyond physical confrontation. Balance over brute force, awareness over reaction, control of self before control of others. The wrestler rose slowly from the chair. He did not loom now. He did not perform. He simply stood a large man reconsidering the architecture of strength. He extended his hand. Bruce Lee rose and accepted it. The handshake was brief but genuine. "What do you call that?" the wrestler asked. Bruce Lee considered the question. "Listening," he said. The wrestler nodded once. For the first time that evening, he returned to his table without occupying the room. And in the quiet that followed, something more enduring than victory settled into place, the recognition that true power is not proven through domination, but revealed through mastery of relationship. 5 seconds had changed nothing visible, but within those 5 seconds a new understanding had begun. The restaurant returned to motion gradually, like a lake settling after a stone has been dropped into its center. Conversations restarted in fragments. Glasses were lifted. A server laughed too brightly at something she hadn't heard. Normalcy reassembled itself piece by piece, but something had changed. Not in the furniture, not in the lighting, not in the arrangement of tables or the scent of food drifting from the kitchen. The change existed in perception, that invisible shift that occurs when an idea moves from abstraction into experience. The large wrestler sat at his table, but he was no longer performing. His companion spoke to him, yet he answered only occasionally. His attention drifted back again and again to the sensation still echoing in his hand. The moment's structure had dissolved without resistance. He flexed his fingers slowly. He had spent years mastering control over other bodies. Yet in 5 seconds he had discovered something he had never trained. The experience of control disappearing without force. It was not defeat. It was exposure. Exposure of an assumption he had never examined. Across the room, Bruce Lee resumed eating. Not as a gesture of dismissal, not as indifference, but because the moment had completed its function. Life continues. Lessons do not require ceremony. He lifted a piece of food, paused briefly, and observed his own breathing steady, unaltered. Conflict had not entered his body because he had never accepted its invitation. This, more than any technique, was the foundation of his discipline. The nervous system is the true battleground of confrontation. Whoever governs their internal state governs the encounter. A server approached his table hesitantly. "Was everything okay?" she asked softly. Bruce Lee looked up and smiled, a genuine, reassuring expression that carried no residue of tension. "Yes," he said. "Everything is learning." She nodded, though she did not fully understand. Yet the calm in his voice was contagious. She left the table standing straighter than she had arrived. Minutes passed. The wrestler rose again. This time no chairs scraped. No attention was demanded. He walked toward Bruce Lee's table with measured steps and stopped at a respectful distance. "May I sit?" he asked. The question itself marked the transformation already underway. Bruce Lee gestured to the chair opposite him. Of course. The large man lowered himself into the seat carefully. As if mindful of the space, he occupied a new awareness replacing habitual dominance. For a moment, neither spoke. The wrestler studied the smaller man with open curiosity. How do you stay calm like that? He asked finally. Bruce Lee placed his hands lightly together. Calm is not the absence of energy, he said. It is energy without conflict. The wrestler absorbed the phrase. My mind was loud, he admitted, even before I came over here. Bruce Lee nodded. Noise seeks opposition, he said. Silence reveals it. The wrestler leaned forward, elbows resting on the table, a posture of engagement rather than challenge. All my training, he said slowly, was about overpowering resistance. If something pushes back, you push harder. He paused. But you didn't push back at all. Bruce Lee's eyes held steady warmth. When you push against a wave, he said, you exhaust yourself. When you move with it, you guide it. The wrestler considered this. So you're saying strength isn't force? Bruce Lee tilted his head slightly. Force is one expression of strength, he said. Control is another. Awareness is the highest. The distinction settled deeply. The wrestler looked around the restaurant at the ordinary people eating ordinary meals, at the quiet rhythms of life that continued regardless of conflict. I thought being strong meant never backing down, he said. Bruce Lee shook his head gently. Backing down and yielding are not the same, he replied. Yielding preserves structure. Backing down abandons it. The wrestler exhaled slowly, as if releasing tension he had carried for years without noticing its weight. Can anyone learn that? He asked. Bruce Lee smiled. Anyone willing to observe themselves honestly, he said. The answer contained no exclusivity, no mystique, only responsibility. The wrestler sat back in his chair, reflecting. In the language of psychology, his internal model of strength had been challenged by direct experience. Such moments create cognitive dissonance, the discomfort that arises when reality contradicts belief. Many respond by rejecting the experience. But growth begins when one allows the contradiction to remain long enough to reshape understanding. He looked at Bruce Lee again. When you said I would learn, he said quietly, you already knew what would happen. Bruce Lee considered before answering. I knew what is possible, he said. Outcome depends on attention. The wrestler nodded. He extended his hand again, not as a test but as a gesture of respect. Thank you, he said. Bruce Lee accepted the handshake. You taught yourself, he replied. The large man returned to his table once more, but this time he did not sit immediately. He stood beside his companions, speaking softly. Their posture changed to curiosity, replacing amusement. Education spreads not through force, but through observation of transformation. Meanwhile, the restaurant's atmosphere continued to normalize. Yet many who had witnessed the encounter carried away an impression that would linger far longer than the taste of their meal. A middle-aged man near the window leaned toward his daughter. What did you see? He asked her. She thought carefully. He didn't try to win, she said. He just understood. The father nodded, though he felt he had learned the same lesson. At Bruce Lee's table, the meal was nearly finished. He placed his chopsticks down and sat in quiet reflection. To him, the encounter was neither victory nor event. It was an example, one of countless moments in which principles reveal themselves through ordinary interaction. He rose, paid the bill, and thanked the staff individually. Each exchange was brief but attentive. Respect, like discipline, is expressed in small, consistent actions rather than dramatic gestures. As he moved toward the exit, the wrestler stood again. Will I see you again? He asked. Bruce Lee paused. You will see the principles again, he said. Whether you recognize them depends on practice. The wrestler nodded, accepting the answer without needing more. Outside, night air carried the cool clarity of late evening. Street lights cast long reflections across the pavement. The world beyond the restaurant continued its vast, indifferent motion. Bruce Lee stepped into that motion with the same calm presence he had brought to the table. Inside, the wrestler remained standing for several seconds after the door closed. He looked down at his hands once more. Then, slowly, he relaxed his shoulders. For the first time that evening, he felt no need to prove anything. Days passed. Transformation rarely announces itself dramatically. It appears first in subtle changes, a pause before reaction, a question where certainty once stood, a willingness to observe rather than assert. The wrestler returned to his training hall. The environment was familiar. Heavy mats, mirrored walls, the scent of effort embedded in the air. His students expected the same instruction they had always received: techniques of leverage, conditioning, power. He began the session as usual. But midway through a demonstration, he stopped. "Control," he said, "is not how much force you apply. It's how little you need." His students looked at one another, surprised by the shift in emphasis. He demonstrated a grip, then released it intentionally, showing how balance changed when tension vanished. "Feel the difference," he told them. Education had begun, not through explanation alone, but through experience shared forward. Weeks later, in another ordinary setting, a disagreement arose between two trainees. Voices rose. Postures hardened. The wrestler stepped between them. He did not shout. He did not command. He simply placed a hand lightly between their lines of force. "Redirect," he said. The word carried weight because it was lived, not merely spoken. Conflict dissolved. The lesson continued. Power, he had learned, is not measured by what one can do to others, but by what one no longer needs to do. And somewhere, in countless moments unobserved by crowds or stories, the ripple of 5 seconds extended into lives that would never know its origin. Years later, a young student asked him a question. "Sensei," the boy said, "what is the most important thing you ever learned about fighting?" The large man paused, remembering a quiet restaurant, a calm presence, a hand that had not resisted. He answered slowly. "That fighting is rarely the lesson," he said. "Understanding is." The boy nodded, though he could not yet grasp the depth of the statement. Understanding arrives with experience. True mastery does not dominate space. It clarifies it. It reveals that strength without awareness is noise, and awareness without ego is power. And sometimes the most profound transformation begins not with a battle, but with a meal, a question, and 5 seconds of perfect attention.